Let's start with that first question of you did write a really insightful book called Ask. And I thought it was a super fun fact that the original working title was The Left Hand Column, which is the same name as the newsletter that I write. So, what inspired you to write like a whole book about left hand columns?
Yeah. So I first became familiar with the idea of the left-hand column because I got to work with Chris Argyris, who was one of the leaders of the field of organizational behavior, who I believe coined the term left-hand column based on the research exercise that he used to do where he would ask people to take out a sheet of paper and bring him some data about a challenging interaction that they had, which was representative of the kinds of things that he wanted people to learn how to handle better. And he asked them to draw a line down the sheet of the paper, and on the right hand side to write down what they said to the other person, almost as if it was a script of a play. I said this, she said this, I said this, she said this. And in the left hand column to write down all of their unspoken thoughts and feelings, the things that they kept private during the conversation. And I got a chance to learn from Chris and work with him. I had the good fortune of not only learning, but also getting to teach other consultants around the world and ultimately our clients around the world. And in the context of doing that, I got to read hundreds and hundreds of these cases, right-hand column, left-hand column cases. And I started to see that if you look at these left-hand columns, all the things that people aren't saying to each other, once you kind of strip away some of the venting or the junk or whatever else, there are some really important things that live in people's left-hand columns. Things like, I can see why your plan is about to fail that you don't see. Or I can see why nobody wants to work with you. Or I can see why you've demotivated your team. Or any number of different things. And these are things that the other person would be far better off if they could find out. But they never did because it stayed stuck in people's left-hand columns. So the book that I was initially thinking about like 20 years ago is just like, what are all these things I'm seeing in the left-hand column? What are the patterns of things that people aren't telling each other that could be really valuable if they did share? And I started off there, and I wanted to always get to, and then what do you do about it? But when I started with this idea of the book and I spoke to my agent about it, it was started as the left-hand column, and then I changed it to the Unspoken because the left-hand column was a little jargony. And my agent said, that's all great, but it's so negative. Like, you have to lead with what's positive. What people can actually do about it. So that's how the book shifted from the left-hand column to Ask. But as you know, the first section of the book is still called The Unspoken, and it's still all about this very thing.
Yeah, well, I love it because there's in the visual in my mind is like how we always say we want to be like a fly on the wall during a
Yes,
conversation, and it's sort of like
yes,
being the fly on the wall and the like inside somebody's head really is what the left hand column is trying to pull
exactly,
out. Um,
exactly.
I'm curious, given all these cases that you've seen and experiences that you've had with the left hand column, what are common barriers that tend to keep these really important ideas and insights sort of stuck inside people's heads?
So there are four big barriers that kind of came out as I've looked across this and done research on it. The number one barrier is fear. And so people are afraid that if they share what's in their left-hand column with the other person, it will have a negative impact. That could be a negative impact on the other person, like maybe it will embarrass them, or maybe it will make them angry, or maybe it will become a burden to them. But it could also be a negative impact on themselves. Like maybe if I share what I'm really thinking, I'll look stupid, or it will finally be revealed that I don't really belong here. Or maybe it will have a negative impact on our relationship. It could put tension in our relationship. So all of those are categories of this fear barrier, which I would say is the biggest one. The other ones are people are tired and they're working hard, they're busy. Oftentimes it takes less work, it's less energy, less demanding to keep it to yourself than to say it to the other person. Because if you say it to the other person, then you have to deal with, they're going to ask you follow-up questions, then they're going to ask you to do something about it, and like, I don't have energy for that. And especially with just how tired everybody is these days. So that's the second one. A third one is sometimes people want to say it, but they don't have the words to say it. They know that if they say it the way it's occurring to them, it probably will make things worse, but they don't have a better way of saying it. And so in the absence of having a better way of saying it, they don't say it at all. Or sort of a variant of that is maybe they do have words to say it, but they don't have time to say it. Like in the sense that I learned that the human mind can think at 900 words a minute, but the human mouth can only speak out 125 words a minute. And so that means that at any given time that you're speaking to someone, you're hearing 15% of what they're actually thinking or what's in their left-hand column, not because they are motivated to withhold from you. It's just that the math doesn't work to get more out of it as well. And then the final barrier that I discovered that keeps things in the left-hand column is that people don't know we want to know from them. People don't know we care to know what they actually really think and feel. And so it's like if they're not interested, if I don't know if they're interested, why bother sharing? Why take the time? Why take the risk? Yeah. I think that last one is most interesting because I think it's the easiest one for us to do something about, to let them know that we are interested, to let them know that we care. But if we don't do that, often people will say, well, I don't know that they're interested.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. Fear, tiredness. I think as a parent of young kids, and for anybody who's working hard in any aspect, whether professionally or personally, I think this affects so many of us these days. I love the fact that you pulled out this mathematical discrepancy on being able to even share these thoughts between what's going on in our head and what comes out of our mouths. And then this last one, I love how you're pulling out, there's this practical aspect of, if there's one thing that we can do, is just letting people know we do want to know, that we don't have to just wonder if they might. And I think this is partly as content creators, people who are trying to get into this world of putting out these ideas. I think that was one of the things that I know I had to get over, was the idea that putting it out there, people did really want to hear from me or from you or from other people who are working in these various fields. When it comes to leaders or executives in particular, are there top gems, so to say, that stay in leaders' minds, and kind of what's the gold that a leader might miss by not examining the gems that are sitting in other people's left-hand columns?
Yes. So this is another thing that I kind of looked at, what the patterns are of what are the things that leaders are not finding out from people around them. One of the biggest things that they're not finding out, and I will say I discovered this the hard way when I was in leadership roles myself, is people often don't share the challenges that they're facing, the struggles, what's really hard for them. So I remember in my first operating role, I was responsible for sort of massive training institutes across the country. And we had one big training institute that was about to start, 500 people coming through it. And it was completely off track. It was about to implode. And all year long, I had been saying to my team, how's it going, basically? And people basically were saying, oh, we got it. Under the surface, they were panicking because it was not going well, but they were not telling me until literally nearly the last minute. And I'm thinking to myself, if you had just told me, I could have helped. I would have rolled up my sleeves. But they were thinking, if we had told me, I probably would have fired them, or all kinds of other things would have happened. But it was very costly for me not to know basically what their struggles were. So that's number one. Another thing is people's true opinions about an issue, especially if it's a controversial issue, especially if they think their views are unpopular or different than what the leader's views are. They will often just keep their views silent. They will not tell you what they really think about something. That's a second one. A third one is feedback. People see what their leaders could do better. People see the impact that their leaders are having on them. And it's quite often that they're not going to tell the leader that feedback, give the leader those suggestions. And then the last one is wild and crazy ideas, ideas that people have that might just be the pivot that the business needs, but they think it's too crazy. No one's going to care about this. No one's going to listen to my idea. And I think what's interesting about that one is it's not a negative thing. It's actually a very positive thing that they're withholding, and yet it's still stuck in the left-hand column.
Yeah, I noticed a thread through all of these where there's this level of vulnerability or putting yourself out there that's involved in being able to voice what's happening in the left-hand column and keeping people from discovering these gems.
Yes.
What are some practical steps that our readers might be able to take to get more comfortable exploring their own left-hand column? And maybe if we get really practically tactical with them, what are some specific questions that you find effective to help others do the same?
Yeah. So in terms of exploring our own left-hand column, one of the things that I find very helpful is to recognize that every one of us, every time we walk into a situation or a meeting or a conversation, is constructing a story in our left-hand column. about what's going on. Chris Argyris, who developed the term right hand, left hand column, also introduced this tool that in the book I talk about as the ladder of understanding, which is basically a model to help us see how we construct those stories that are in our left-hand column. And basically says, anytime we walk into a situation, instantaneously we're picking out little pieces of information, ignoring the rest of it, forgetting that we've ignored the rest of it, instantaneously interpreting those pieces of information and drawing conclusions about them until it gets to be our story. And then once we have that story, we don't remember that we actually went through that process of weaving that story. We just think that's how the world is. And so to kind of get comfortable with or become reflective about our own left-hand column, it's helpful to remind ourselves that we've got a story going on and that was just one of many different stories that we could have constructed. And I talk about different kinds of curiosity sparks that we can ask ourselves to loosen up the grip of the story that we have in our left-hand column. So for example, we could say to ourselves, this is what I was seeing, but what else might have been going on? What else might I have been overlooking? Or how else might someone have interpreted what I saw in a different way than mine? What are different conclusions that they could draw? As a side note, I have been finding that it's incredibly fun to use AI as a thought partner in doing that. So if you take your story that's in your left-hand column, dump it into AI, and it could be like a rant or event or whatever, and then you just add, what might I be missing? All of a sudden, AI can help you reflect on your left-hand column. And the whole idea is to be reflective enough about your left-hand column that you have reduced the kind of maybe the toxic nature of it or reduced the grip that it has on you so that it's easier to share in your right-hand column. Or so that you have enough question marks in your story that you can become curious to ask the other person. So those are a few thoughts of kind of like dealing with our own left-hand column. Do you want me to flip over and say, now what about inviting other people to share their left-hand column?
Yes, I would love that. And thank you for sharing that, because one of the things that I do with my clients is talk about, what is that story that you're telling yourself right now, and what are other stories that could be going on. And I like to steal from Dr. Becky, the parenting expert, because she has so much wonderful content out there. But she talks about a most generous interpretation. And I feel like it's the encouragement to come up with like, what's the alternative story that's in our heads that takes into account some of these other pieces of information that we've sort of put aside.
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to, necessarily get yourself to a generous alternate story. But if you can at least get yourself to a curious one to say, maybe mine is not the only story that's going on, I think even that can help.
Yeah, and I love the use case of bringing in AI as that thought partner, especially when we know like there's probably a blind spot. But hey, technology, what a fantastic way to be able to use AI, because I think we're all still trying to experiment and explore and figure out like, how do I use this to its utmost? And this sounds like a fabulous use case.
I love it also because you don't have to, you don't have to admit to somebody else what your story is. Like you can do it in the privacy of your own phone or desk or computer, but you can start to get a reflective partner as well.
Absolutely.
So then in terms of inviting out other people's, true thoughts and feelings, their left-hand columns, I'll say a few things. One is, it actually starts with curiosity. I mean, this is what the book is about, this 5-step ask approach. And the first step is curiosity for a reason, because if we are not really curious what the other person thinks and feels in us, if we think we know it, we think they're a jerk, we think they're wrong, whatever else, they're not going to share. They're going to sense that. But if we are genuinely curious, if we're genuinely interested to learn from them, we radiate an energy that almost invites them to share with us. So the first thing is curiosity. The second thing I'll say is, we've got to make it safe for them to tell us their truth, especially if it's a hard truth. This is one of the, going back to that story that I shared from my own leadership failure, I was curious to learn from my team, but they didn't feel safe telling me their truth. And that lack of safety gets exacerbated across lines of difference, whether that can be a power difference, racial difference, gender difference, any number of identity markers can diminish sense of safety. And so we've got to work extra hard to establish that safety, or what I call make it safe for other people to share. There's lots of ways to do that, including how and when and where do we create connection with people so there's trust? How do we open up first before we ask them to open up? How do we, what I call, radiate resilience so they can get confidence that we can handle their truth as well? All of that is about making it safe. And then the third, I think, is it's about asking better questions. Like if you say to somebody, do you have any feedback for me? That is very different than saying to them, what's one thing I could do better? Both of them are looking for feedback, but they have very different impact on people. And so I think a lot of us don't realize that the way that we design and construct our questions has an enormous bearing on whether and how much we learn from other people.
And I love how that that last piece of how we ask the question specifically actually comes back to how we are curious.
Exactly.
We're curious too.
Exactly.
But I love all these themes that you're pulling out because it comes up when I'm talking to leaders in my day to day about the things that challenge them, and they will say things to me like, "But I tell them I want to hear their feedback. I want them to be, telling me the hard truths. I'm so open to it." And then I talk to their teams, and the teams are like, "Yeah, but like when we actually do it, I don't actually feel safe." Or there was that a time, even though it was a year ago, and even though they've changed, like I still have trauma from that time where they weren't as safe.
I totally
my actual feeling.
I mean, literally, I've been doing a 360 for a leader, and I spoke to her this morning, and she said she was telling me about someone on her team who I had already interviewed, and she said, like, this person will not give me any constructive feedback, despite the fact that I ask and I ask and I ask. And having talked to the person, I know exactly why, because the person's afraid of her. And I said, people are afraid of you. And she said, why would they be afraid of me? And so we don't realize the especially people in leadership positions, the power of the position and the ways in which that can reduce people's psychological safety.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was about to ask you, and I wonder if we're answering it here, is what's the biggest mistake that executives make when trying to understand their team or their organization's left-hand column? And what's one piece of advice, to take your advice on how to ask the question, what's one piece of advice you'd give these leaders to improve?
I think the biggest thing that people in leadership roles miss is exactly what we were saying, is the level of psychological lack of safety that people feel around them, even if the leader themselves don't think that people should feel scared. Like, as a leader, I often walk around thinking like, I'm just like a dumb schmuck. I'm like making it up as I go along. I'm doing my best in life. Why would anyone feel intimidated by me? Or why would anyone feel afraid to tell me what they really think and feel? And that is such a blind spot, because I'm overlooking even just like the power of the formal authority that I have, let alone any other dimensions of race or age or gender or any other kinds of things that people have. And so I think that's a huge blind spot for so many leaders. And then in terms of, what's one thing that leaders can do, I would say, I mean, when someone takes the risk and gives you a piece of feedback or a suggestion or tells you something that might be unpopular or hard, the way that you react in that moment determines everything about whether they will say something in the future. And by the way, not just whether they will say something in the future, but whether other people will say something in the future, because there becomes like a mythology around it. Like, how did he or she react when they were given some feedback? And so if you're a leader and you've got that someone's taken the chance to give you that feedback, the best thing that you can do is to publicly thank them, reflect on the feedback, let other people know how important that was to you, let them in on your own reflective process, even if that was painful or hard. Show them how your behavior is going to change from it, and then ask a question, which is, how well does that line up to what you think I should be learning from this? And what else should I be learning? I call that, in the ask approach, the final step called reflect and reconnect with people, which is essentially taking them through your reflective process and connecting back with them to thank them for that and asking them if you've learned the right things.
Yeah, I love that reflect and connect, because I think that really is the piece that draws it back to, like, I really genuinely want to learn from this and change from it. And it is so much a challenge for leaders. And I think people in general, of being able to learn in the moment. It's hard. Learning can be frustrating and scary and all the things. And we're all human. So in that moment to be like, oh, I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Totally.
It's not natural. It's a learned skill. Absolutely. So
it can be that you come back to it after a little bit. Like, it doesn't have to be literally right in the moment, but it's such a powerful lever that you have as a leader, because if you're doing that, you're also modeling that for other people. And so if you want other people on your team and your organization to be open to feedback and asking for help, the greatest lever you have is for them to see you do it too.
It's something I'll talk about with leaders around the right to give feedback is predicated on your ability to receive it. And it's exactly lined up with what you're telling us here and what you've seen and experienced and researched. So
I love that phrase too. Thank you for sharing that.
yes. Well, last but not least, since we're talking about the left-hand column, I'm curious, what's a question that you're currently exploring in your own left-hand column?
I'm really wrestling with actually the question of curiosity, and how can I get more curious in moments when I might feel righteous or judgmental or frustrated? What are some of the practices that I can do myself? And then how can I help other people do the same thing?
Absolutely. I feel like with any of these types of questions of I want to be something, but in the moment I'm not. The
Yeah.
first question I usually start with is like, are you aware in that moment that you are getting righteous or that you are not curious as you could be in this moment? And if not, then it's like, how do we figure out how do we build that awareness? And then if we are aware, it's okay, well, what's the sort of the replacement behavior that we would ideally want to have in that moment of how to be more curious? But I agree with you. It's so challenging of like these ideals. Like we know, even since I mentioned Dr. Becky earlier, like even she will say like, I know what I'm supposed to be doing in this moment with my child, but when I am under duress or like not at my best or I'm extra tired, it's we're human and it's figuring out both like the self-compassion piece coupled with, okay, how do I learn and build the muscles and know that it'll take practice and time to get to being more curious in these moments where I really just want to be like, no, you know what? I know better.
Exactly.
I'd like to actually one last tip we can leave with readers on this front is like, if we know we can get to like more of this I call it like being the judge in that moment, as opposed to how can I be more of a scientist? Sometimes just like putting on a hat can be really helpful. Of like, I'm going to approach this as a scientist in this discussion, as opposed to like my regular being just Jess. I'm now a scientist, and that changes it. Or I might go into a discussion and say, I'm going to be an anthropologist. Like, I'm not going to have any conclusions about why people are doing. I'm just observing these behaviors. And afterwards, I will figure things out. But in the moment, I'm just taking it in. And so I think sometimes having those roles that we can play can be really powerful to help people just step out of their normal and into something that feels a little different.
I love that frame. Yeah. And to me, it lines up with something that I often also offer, which is to recenter our minds on this question of what can I learn here? What can I learn from this person? And when that is our frame, which I think is very consistent with being a scientist or an anthropologist or whatever else, all of a sudden other things start to fade away. Like, why are they a jerk? Or why are they doing? And it's just like, no, this is just about learning right now. Then we can figure out what to do with it.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining today, Jeff.
This is great. So much fun. I can't wait to see where you go with this. And I'd love to keep our conversation going. And anything else I can share or do or send, just let me know.
Will do. Thank you so much.